Welcome to Taiwan Talk. I'm your host, Dennis Weng. Today's episode dives into one of the most urgent and strategic issues and in global trade, the escalating U.S.-China tariff war, and Taiwan's increasingly complex position in it. Joining us today is someone who has spent in his entire career at the intersection of diplomacy, strategy, and policy between the United States and China. I'm honored to welcome David Firestein, inaugural president and CEO of the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S.-China Relations, former U.S. diplomat, and one of the most respected and intellectually honest voice on U.S.-China relations. David, thank you for joining us today.
Dennis, thank you so much. It's great to be with you.
Thank you. Well, David, let's start with the big headline. President Trump recently announced a 145% tariff on Chinese goods, a dramatic escalation in the trade war. How should we interpret this move? Is it purely economic leverage, or is there a broader strategic calculus behind it?
Well, first of all, I don't think that the Liberation Day tariff levels that President Trump announced are fundamentally about economics or trade. I think they're really more about politics. And I don't think they're for foreign consumption, but rather they're for domestic consumption. The tariffs don't make any sense for the United States in any way that you look at them. They really don't have any positive effect whatsoever on the United States economy, either in the near term, the midterm, or the longer term. So they're not really about enhancing U.S. economic performance. If one is looking at this through an economic prism. But I think they are about conveying to the American public a kind of toughness, a kind of willingness to take bold action, and a willingness to do things differently, to shake things up, and to hold to account some of the countries that, as Trump sees it and as many others see it, have not treated the United States fairly or reciprocally. Obviously, China is at the head of the pack in that regard, and has been subjected to by far the highest levels of tariffs. But I think the fundamental point that I would make is that when looking at Liberation Day and when looking at these incredible tariff levels that we see that are really unprecedented in the modern era, you have to understand them through the lens of politics, not so much through the lens of economics.
But what could be the blowback on the U.S. economy, global supply chain, and particularly on Asian economies like Taiwan? Or is that really, bring a lot of pressure on China and kind of make China change their mind?
Well, a couple of points on that. First of all, if tariffs were so effective at changing Chinese behavior, then presumably we wouldn't still need them 7 years after they were first adopted. So it's very clear to me that tariffs obviously don't have a significant impact or even an appreciable impact on Chinese behavior, or for that matter, the behavior of most other major players. But thus far, China has been the principal emphasis or focal point of this tariff approach. And so, I think we have to look at that and say there must be some other reason that President Trump is doing this, because obviously they don't do what he says they're going to do. One of the other fundamental problems with the tariffs is that for 10 years, President Trump has falsely stated that it's the foreign countries, including China, for example, that pay the tariffs, when the fact is it's just demonstrably, empirically, and factually false. The truth is tariffs are a federal tax on U.S. importers, and the brunt of that tax is borne first by the importers and then ultimately virtually entirely by the consumer, the American consumer. And so this is a huge tax increase on the American people. I don't look at it, and I don't think any objective observer that understands economics should look at this as something that is going to put pressure on other countries. It really is putting pressure on us, and it's giving other countries leverage over us. I sort of liken it to the metaphor of, let's say, I'm negotiating with you, Dennis, and I say, I'm going to punch myself in the face really hard until you do what I want you to do. That's what these tariffs are, and it's why they don't work. It's why we apparently still need them, in Donald Trump's view, 7 years after they were first implemented. If they worked so well, we wouldn't need them by now.
But well, I like the metaphor, but it seems like a lot of people don't quite understand the situation. But now let's turn into Taiwan in particular. There's a growing frustration in Taipei after the U.S. imposed a 32% tariff, even though it's relatively lower than the tariff on China. But still, a 32% tariff on Taipei on Taiwan's made good, despite the island being a very close partner or allies to the US. How do you interpret this? Why would the US place such a steep tariff on Taiwan while strengthening security cooperation?
Well, you're right to point out the fact that it's incongruous. It's odd. But then again, just about everything about this entire policy approach has been odd and seemingly not very thoughtful. So Taiwan now has been lumped in with the various countries that the United States has imposed steep tariffs on, including Canada, Mexico, all the countries in the world at one level or another, but Canada and Mexico in terms of auto parts, steel, and autos themselves. That also, by the way, affects Taiwan, which does produce
Mm.
some autos and auto parts. And what it shows is that this administration has simply not drawn a distinction between allies and friends and extremely close trading partners on the one hand, and competitors, rivals, and adversaries, and arguably enemies on the other. And it's mystifying and baffling, I think, to most objective observers that the president would treat Taiwan, for example, in more or less the same way that it treats countries that are far less friendly to the United States. Obviously, the United States and Taiwan have a very close, unofficial relationship, but it is a very close relationship. I think it's a great friendship, and it's a very important relationship for both Taiwan and for the United States. And levying a 32% tariff, a so-called reciprocal tariff on Taiwan, that was calculated in a way that was baffling to most economists in any case. It doesn't make sense if one is looking at this through the normal prism of rationality. But again, what President Trump seems to be trying to do is to look at the trading partners of the United States that have major surpluses with the United States and trying to level out those surpluses and to create a greater optic, if not reality, of fairness and reciprocity in terms of trading relationships. And he's not distinguishing, as I said, between allies, friends, and close partners on the one hand, and competitors and adversaries on the other. And I think it's a misguided approach at many different levels, and I can understand why there is frustration in Taiwan about this approach.
So a lot of Taiwanese people kind of frustrated about the situation, and hopefully, the tariff will be lifted. So the next question for you is, do you think there's a realistic chance that the current Trump administration will lift tariff on Taiwan soon, or is Taiwan being caught in the crossfire of the U.S. economic policy that doesn't differentiate between, just you mentioned, friend and rivals?
Well, it's a very good question. And I think the truth is, we really don't know the answer to that question at this point. And it's hard to predict because Trump is such a mercurial and erratic figure. He, announces tariffs, then he takes it back, then he says, yes, we do have them, then he says, no, we don't, then he says they're 10%, no, they're 145%, they're 25%, they're zero, there's exceptions, there's not exceptions. It's a very confusing and incoherent picture, unintelligible picture, really makes it impossible for countries or companies to make long-term decisions because there simply is no way to know what the policy is going to be in 20 minutes, let alone tomorrow, next week, next month, or next year. With respect to Taiwan, I sense that there is a recognition that Taiwan is a very close friend and partner of the United States, certainly a very important trading partner. And it is possible that the 32% reciprocal tariff will be decreased or that some new approach will overtake this approach. And there may end up being a better status quo in terms of US Taiwan trade. But it's also possible that since economic rationality does not seem to be governing most of these decisions, that we could see continued irrationality and a continued reliance on exorbitant tariffs, including relative to our friends and close trading partners. And I think it really is hard to predict. But I think if I were a betting man, I would guess that over time there will probably be some relief in terms of the tariffs that have been applied to Taiwan, but mainly because those tariffs on Taiwan imports into the United States are bad for America. The tariffs are
Mm.
bad for America, and ultimately, over some period of time, I think the pressure is going to build here in the United States among American importers and among American consumers to get to send a clear signal to the Trump administration that these tariffs, whether toward Taiwan or others, are just bad for business, bad for our economy, bad for our prosperity, bad for the stock market, bad for employment, bad for prices. And I think that pressure is going to build. And I think that we're going to see some de-escalation, probably unilateral de-escalation on the part of the Trump administration to try to walk back this imbecilic set of policies that they put in place.
Yes, we do hope that President Trump and the team kind of realizing that it's probably, not reciprocal, but actually hurting both sides. As we all know, that Taiwan is the world's most important producer of advanced semiconductor, the computer chips. So we really like to know, how does the U.S. view Taiwan's technology dominance? Is it seen as an asset to be protected, or a vulnerability that need to be moved onshore?
Well, that's a really good question, Dennis. And here's what I would say. Obviously, Taiwan, as you rightly point out, is the world leader when it comes to the production of the most advanced semiconductor chips out there, and those are integral to the most important advances in the high tech sector generally around the world. And they're going to be more and more important as we go forward. So there's no question that Taiwan is a vital player in the world economy in that regard, as well as in other regards, but particularly in terms of chips. Um, there's no doubt that the United States, if you're looking at where the most advanced chips are made, it obviously is in the United States' interest that those chips, if they're not made in the United States, then at least are made somewhere that is very friendly to the United States and that is a reliable partner of the United States. And Taiwan certainly fits the bill in that regard. Obviously, the United States would much rather have Taiwan be the place where those chips are made than, let's say, China or Russia or North Korea or Belarus or countries like that. So, in that regard, I think the United States is glad to know that these chips are produced in a place where we have a very friendly and well-established relationship. That being said, I think it's also true if you look at President Trump's actions over the first 100 days of this term and also his prior term. He really is about, as he would put it, America first.
Mm.
And I think he definitely prioritizes at least his perception of what is in the United States' interest, even if advancing that interest has a negative or deleterious impact on a close ally or close friend. This movement toward trying to bring chip production from Taiwan over to the United States, I think reflects that. It reflects a kind of hedging, perhaps relative to cross-strait scenarios that could materialize, but it also reflects a desire for the United States to generate, working with Taiwan and others, to generate an indigenous capacity to produce these chips. And that could be a source of concern for Taiwan because it would take one of its great comparative advantages and strategic assets and strategic traits as a player in international trade and neutralize it to a degree. So I think this can play out in a number of different ways, but I do think that the chips factor is a major consideration in the way that the United States looks at Taiwan overall.
Yes, indeed. Well, I'd like to just a little bit follow up question on this. We've seen a rising pressure from Washington for Taiwan's company like TSMC and other to invest more in the U.S. and try to have this supply chain, the manufacture, the fab here to produce computer chips. I mean, because the cost is way higher here in the States. Given what we learned from economy and from the trade, from theory, the comparative advantage. I just wondering, is this really benefit the U.S.?
Well, I think it's a fair question. And, you mentioned comparative advantage, and I just want to say a word or two about that. At a very fundamental level, the Trump administration simply does not seem to accept or acknowledge the existence of the principle of comparative advantage in global trade. I mean, this is an administration that essentially wants to produce, or at least says that it wants to produce pretty much everything in the United States, whether that's rubber flip-flops to use when you go to the swimming pool, or whether it's T-shirts, or whether it's, as Secretary Lutnick recently said, screwing in the little screws into iPhones. Secretary Lutnick has said comically that he would like to see an army of millions of Americans screwing in little screws into iPhones. This administration is expressing a vision of bringing things back to the United States in terms of manufacturing that shouldn't be in the United States because we don't have the comparative advantage or the labor costs that would make that an economically sensible and rational thing to do. So there is a rejection of the very construct of comparative advantage. And it's a rejection of the very construct, therefore, of globalization, which is predicated on comparative advantage. To the point about the issue of the chips, I mean, I think I can see reasons why Taiwan would want to hang on to this particular industry as long as it can, because it does give Taiwan an outsized importance in the international trading system and in the world economy, an importance I would say very disproportionate to Taiwan's size with again about 23 million people, et cetera. It is a major league player despite its very small size, largely because of the chips. But the dynamics now are such that the United States is very keen on reshoring or so-called friendshoring or bringing back manufacturing to the shores of the United States, even where it doesn't necessarily make sense. And so you see this kind of this effort on the part of the United States to bring some of this over to the United States. And it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. Ultimately, what we're seeing is decision making on the part of the Trump administration that really isn't about rational economics. It's about security. It's predicated in fundamental misunderstandings of what tariffs are, what the deficit is, what trade flows mean, why deficits are generated, and the very fundamentals of economics seem to be lost on this administration. And how this all plays out, I think, is going to be very interesting to see over the coming weeks and months. But my guess is over time, the laws of economics and the laws of comparative advantage and the laws of cost and the notion of maximizing profit and profitability, these fundamental rules of economic life are going to impose their will on decisions that are made. And I think that the Trump administration is going to ignore that at its own peril.
We now, passed the first 100 days into President Trump's second term. And, how would you assess the administration's early performance on U.S.-China policy, particularly in the area of trade, Taiwan, and technology? Has it followed a coherent strategy, or are we seeing a more technical, headline-driven moves?
Well, I don't think the strategy has been very coherent. I mean, I think that's an easy question to answer. And let me explain what I mean. So there are two different elements that have emerged as contours of Trump 2.0 policy toward China. That is to say, the policy of this second presidential term of Donald Trump and his administration. There's a hardline element and there is a conciliatory, and I would even say capitulatory element to it as well. On the hardline side, we obviously see the tariffs and we see the restrictiveness, particularly toward the mainland, in terms of technology flows and restrictiveness that the United States government is imposing on the U.S. private sector in terms of what the private sector can or cannot transfer or sell to China in terms of the highest technology items and capabilities. So that represents, I think, a continuation of the hardline approach to China that we saw emerge in the first Trump term and that we saw continue in President Biden's 4 years in the Oval Office. On the other side of the ledger, there are some really surprisingly conciliatory postures. You mentioned Taiwan, but I think the Taiwan, TikTok, human rights, and the Russia-Ukraine war are four areas where I see the United States adopting a surprisingly or shockingly conciliatory or even capitulatory stance toward the mainland in ways that I think probably surprise a lot of people. On Taiwan, President Trump himself has spoken about Taiwan extremely transactionally, even to the point of giving an interview in the summer of last year when he was a candidate for a second term as president with Bloomberg, stating that Taiwan should look at the United States as an insurance company. And I'm paraphrasing closely. He basically said, if Taiwan pays the United States money, then we may consider protecting Taiwan in the event of a mainland attack. But if Taiwan doesn't pay what Donald Trump thinks Taiwan should pay, then we're not going to protect Taiwan. That's what he said on the record to Bloomberg in a wide-ranging interview where this question was asked. And that is a very concerning attitude if one cares about the security of Taiwan. But also he's flip-flopped on TikTok. He was against it in his first term. He was against TikTok continuing to be available in the United States. Now he's for it. He has been very soft on China on human rights. I don't think we've ever seen a president say less about human rights or use the bully pulpit less than Donald Trump when it comes to criticizing China's deplorable human rights practices. And perhaps most shockingly of all, President Trump has totally capitulated to Russia on Ukraine based on all of his statements and all of his negotiating positions. He seems to be trying to pressure Ukraine to absolutely surrender and capitulate to Russia on Russia's terms. And where this relates to China is up until January 20th of this year, the United States goal with respect to China, insofar as the Russia-Ukraine conflict was concerned, was to get China to cease and desist from supporting Russia directly or indirectly through trade, the provision of material, or the provision of technologies or other goods or know-how that would help Russia prosecute its war against Ukraine. And particularly the concern revolved around sensitive technologies that were dual use. Now, far from getting China to cease and desist, the United States has actually gone much further than China in siding with Vladimir Putin against Ukraine, even to the point where we, the United States, voted with Russia and against all of our allies to shoot down a resolution that simply said that Russia was the aggressor in the war. And as I often point out, even China didn't vote against that resolution. China abstained. So in all these other ways, there's a lot of conciliation. But Dennis, the last thing I would say on this is, as we assess the first 100 days of the Trump administration, I think we can also look back at the last 8 years and recognize that the sad truth is that the policies of the United States have not achieved in any area the stated and desired objectives of the implementers of those policies. We've run huge trade deficits with China, huge merchandise trade deficits with China over the course of the entire Trump presidency, record-setting. We've run the 7 largest deficits with the world under Trump and Biden that we've ever had in our history. We've done nothing to solve any of the fundamental trade problems. We've seen China become vastly more aggressive toward Taiwan than we have ever seen in history. We've seen China become significantly more aggressive in the South China Sea than we've ever seen in the modern era. We've seen China's military grow in budget and capabilities at a faster rate than we have ever seen since we normalized relations with China. China's technology is advancing in ways that are shocking the American technology community. We've caved to China on the Russia-Ukraine war stance. And on human rights, Trump presided over a period of time where China committed serious violations of human rights in Xinjiang and rolled back democratic and expression freedoms in Hong Kong. So my punchline is this, Dennis. In what universe do those results look like success for American policy toward China? And the answer is in no universe except in La La Land. And that seems to be where we're operating. But by any metric that we ourselves would use to assess the efficacy of US policy toward China, every single thing is worse today than it was 8 years ago, according to the implementers of the policy. So it's not that I'm saying everything's worse, it's that the people who implemented the policies all say that everything is worse. And that's why I would give this administration a failing grade when it comes to China, because they're not achieving their own objectives. And on the course that we're on, they're not going to. So I think we need to take a serious look at that and course correct and get ourselves to a better place where we actually achieve the results that we say that we want to achieve.
Yeah, I agree with you. I hope we can correct it as rapidly. And we all know ideal situation. There's a gap between ideal situation and reality. But it seems to us, that the gap is getting bigger and bigger, and we hope we can reverse it. Another controversial idea floating around policy circle and scholarly, discussion is that a tense or unstable Taiwan Strait relations benefit the U.S. strategic interests by keeping Taiwan aligned with the U.S. and keeping China on edge. Do you think Washington truly favor peace in the Strait, or is managed tension seen as a strategic lever?
Well, I think the United States does want peace. I think the United States does want stability across the Taiwan Strait. I don't think either this administration or previous administrations have ever wanted to see a kinetic military conflict erupt across the strait. And because that would very possibly implicate the United States in that conflict, and the cost of such a conflict militarily and economically and in every way would be massive, and nobody would emerge from it unscathed. So I do believe that the United States wants to see peace, and I do believe the United States wants to see stability. But what I would add is, and I'm going to just speak very candidly. I used to be a U.S. official. I'm not anymore. Have not been for a very, very long time. And in no way, shape, or form do I speak for the U.S. government. But that allows me to tell the truth as I see it. And what I would say is, I think the most important objective for the United States with respect to the topic of Taiwan is, and if I were using a kind of a one sentence summary of the U.S. objective relative to Taiwan, it would be this: within the constraints of the one China policy that stipulates that the United States extend formal official diplomatic recognition to the People's Republic of China and not extend formal diplomatic recognition to the Republic of China, but within the constraints of the so-called one China policy, the United States seeks to do every single thing in our human power to prevent reunification or unification from ever occurring. That's what I believe the U.S. objective is. That's not what we say. That's not the de jure policy. It's not the stated policy. But I think if you look at everything that we have done in recent years, both under Trump 1.0, under Biden, and under Trump 2.0, I believe that the through line is the idea of wanting to gum up the works and prevent and thwart reunification from occurring. That's what I think the United States wants to see. So as long as the status quo, the current status quo obtains, which is that there's no reunification, no independence, neither side is trying to coerce the other side into something it doesn't want. This status quo is the optimal status quo for the United States. And I believe the United States would like to see this status quo continue indefinitely, if not permanently. I
Hmm.
suspect that Taiwan would probably view it the same way, but obviously China looks at it, the mainland looks at it very differently. But that being said, the fact that they haven't launched a military assault on Taiwan suggests that they believe that this immediate current status quo is the best situation that they can see at the present time. And as long as this status quo continues, I think the United States will be satisfied with this status quo.
Would you say, the Washington would encourage a peaceful dialogue or economic interdependence or strategic ambiguity or deterrence across Taiwan Strait? Which one would be better, and would you say, the Washington will actually encourage the cross-strait relation getting better or keep the way as, the tension escalated now?
Well, so with respect to the possibility or the desirability of dialogue, I don't think the United States has a particularly strong view on that per se. At least I don't sense that the U.S. does. Obviously, the U.S. stated position is that we want to see peaceful resolution of the cross-strait issues. But if I can add a little bit of texture and nuance to that, I don't necessarily think that the United States wants any resolution other than the resolution that we already have, which is the status quo. But if there were ever going to be some different resolution, then obviously we would want that resolution to be peaceful and to not involve any coercion in any direction. And we would want to make sure that the will of people on both sides of the Taiwan Strait is respected, so that neither side is imposing its will or coercing or unilaterally changing the status quo in a way that the other side doesn't want. But that being said, while we state that we want peaceful resolution, I think the fact is we regard the current situation as peaceful resolution
Mm.
de facto. I don't think the United States cares a lot whether there is or isn't dialogue. Um, all things being equal, I think the United States would say, hey, dialogue is great. But look, the issues are so profound and the incompatibility of the objectives of the mainland on the one hand and Taiwan on the other is so existential that I don't think there is any amount of dialogue that is going to be able to bridge that gap. And if anything, I think the gap has grown significantly over the last several decades as Taiwan public opinion has shifted away from any notion of wanting to having any enthusiasm at all for the idea of reunification. So, I don't think the United States wants to see tension. I think the United
Mhm.
States is certainly comfortable with seeing a high level of economic integration between the mainland and Taiwan. That exists. It has existed for a long time, and I think it will continue to exist on a pretty substantial scale. But and dialogue is great. But these issues really go beyond the reach of dialogue. These issues are existential. There is a fundamental existential incompatibility between the political and social systems of Taiwan and the mainland. Unless and until that incompatibility is somehow resolved, there will never be reunification, certainly not without the mainland having to use force to generate it. And so, again, it all ends up coming back to the same point, and that is, if I can coin a phrase, the status quo today is the absolute worst possible situation we could have, except for every other conceivable scenario. So it's sort of a paraphrasing of what Winston Churchill said about democracy, the worst form of government in the world, except for all the rest, all the others. And the current status quo is the worst, except for every other possibility. So that's why the status quo has existed for decades, and that's why I believe it will exist for several more decades as we go forward.
Yes, I concur. Yeah, well, I do believe people may not be very satisfied with what we have now, but at the same time, we don't have any possible or better alternative at this
Right.
moment. Taiwan has long benefited from, preferential trade treatment, but now with tariff in mind in place, do you think Taiwan should be pushing for bilateral trade agreement with Washington, or is it politically off the table under Trump 2.0?
Well, I think it's hard to say whether it is something that could be embraced as a concept by the United States or whether it is off the table. Trump is really an X factor. I mean, he is unpredictable. He is erratic. He changes his mind on things. We've seen that just with the tariffs. So, just within that one body of policy, there's been dozens of changes of mind that we've seen evidenced by President Trump, including just within the last few days in terms of trying to give the American auto industry some relief from the tariffs that President Trump himself imposed. So it's unpredictable as to whether the Trump administration could embrace this idea, but it's certainly clear that the issue, it's not just the economics and the trade aspects of a potential or possible U.S.-Taiwan trade agreement. It's the political sensitivity around that from the mainland standpoint. Anything that smacks of the United States and Taiwan engaging each other as countries, quote unquote, or engaging each other in the way that countries with formal diplomatic recognition and formal diplomatic relationships engage with each other, that's going to be very sensitive to the Chinese. That could lead to reactions and actions on their part that complicate the overall picture between the United States and the mainland, could lead to some interesting dynamics and concerning dynamics between the mainland and Taiwan. So, yes, at the level of economics and trade, maybe there is a case for Taiwan to look at that, and maybe the United States might have an interest in discussing some of those things. But at a different level, at the level of politics and at the level of the incredible sensitivity of the topic of Taiwan as an issue in U.S.-China relations, there would be a lot of complications and complexities and sensitivities around that. And that's something that I think would be have to be taken into account by both Taiwan itself and also the United States if they were to want to pursue this possible idea.
So my final question for you is that if you were advising leaders in Taipei right now, what would you tell them about navigating the trade war, the uncertainty, managing technology partnership, and maintaining the U.S. support? For the leader in Taiwan, maybe even for the private sector's owner.
Well, what I would say is, this is a president who clearly um, is very concerned with the issue of reciprocity and fairness as he sees it. I don't think this president really understands economics or trade. In fact, I think it's very clear that he does not. But he is very attached to the notion that the trading relationships between the United States and China, and the United States, Taiwan, China, and any other trading partners should be fair, that we should treat each other in ways that reflect fairness, reciprocity, and so on. And with respect to Taiwan, I think to the extent that Taiwan can open up markets that maybe have been less open to U.S. goods and services, and Taiwan is a relatively very open economy, but to the extent that there are areas, as President Lai himself said in a recent address, where improvements can be made with respect to non-tariff barriers, for example, with respect even to some tariff levels, to the extent that Taiwan can open up even further, that would go a long way toward ameliorating the kinds of concerns that President Trump has expressed, not just with respect to Taiwan, but with respect to all of our trading partners, including Canada, Mexico, Great Britain, Germany, Japan, South Korea, Australia, all of our best friends, allies, as well as Taiwan itself. So trying to generate as much reciprocity as possible, I think would be a good strategy for Taiwan. And at the same time, I think continuing to do the things that have made Taiwan one of the most successful economies in the world, and to double down on smart policy and a commitment to the market and a commitment to being a significant player in world trade and to being a close and valued friend of the United States. And all of those things, I think, are things that would be beneficial for Taiwan insofar as its relationship with the United States is concerned. And I am optimistic that the United States and Taiwan will continue to enjoy a really close relationship as we go forward. And there's a lot that Taiwan can do, as well as the United States, to ensure that that's so. And that's what I hope we'll see happen.
Well, thank you so much. We all want to, keep this optimistic, sentiment and mindset with us. So, David, this has been an incredible, insightful conversation. Thank you for breaking down such a complex issue with clarity, and of course, you will always be very candid to us. Your perspective on U.S.-China-Taiwan relations is more important now than ever. So to our audience, thank you for tuning in our program. Until next time, I'm Dennis Weng. Thank you, David, for joining us today.